Think ancient people were more civilized because they built temples and wrote poetry? Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Behind those magnificent pyramids and philosophical treatises lay religious practices so disturbing, they'd make Indian street food look like a McDonald's Happy Meal. But here's the thing that'll keep you watching until the end. I'm going to reveal the one psychological factor that made all these civilizations commit the same horrifying acts, despite being separated by thousands of miles and centuries. It's something that still drives human behavior today, and once you see it, you'll never look at religious practices the same way again. We're talking about civilizations that burn children alive to make it rain. But that's not even the worst part. These weren't isolated incidents by crazy individuals. These were organized, systematic religious practices endorsed by entire civilizations. And here's the twist that connects them all. There's a pattern hidden in these rituals that reveals something terrifying about human psychology. Something that explains why the most civilized societies often produce the most barbaric practices. I'll reveal this pattern at the end, but first, you need to see the evidence. So let's start with the Carthaginians, because what they did to children will make everything else seem almost reasonable by comparison. The Carthaginians were sophisticated traders who nearly conquered Rome. They had advanced mathematics, complex trade networks, and beautiful art. They were also running what can only be described as an industrial-scale child murder operation for over 6 centuries. Picture this, a massive bronze statue of a bull-headed god with arms extended over a furnace. Now picture parents placing their living children into those red-hot bronze arms while musicians played loudly to drown out the screaming. But that's just the setup. The real horror is in the details I'm about to reveal. This wasn't some rare emergency ritual. The Tafet Cemetery in modern Tunisia contains thousands of urns filled with the cremated remains of infants and children. Thousands. But here's what the archaeologists found that'll make your skin crawl. And it connects to that psychological pattern I mentioned earlier. The process was methodical and horrifying. According to Diodorus Siculus, who documented these practices, the bronze statue was heated until it glowed red-hot. Parents would then place their children, often their firstborn, into the statue's arms. The children would roll down into the furnace below while the crowd sang hymns and played instruments to honor Moloch. But here's where it gets really twisted, and this is where you start to see the pattern. Parents weren't allowed to show emotion. Crying or displaying grief would invalidate the sacrifice. Imagine watching your child burn alive while forcing yourself to smile because showing sadness might anger your god. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical horror. The Carthaginians weren't monsters. They were business people. They believed Moloch protected their trade routes and military campaigns in exchange for the most precious thing they could offer, their children's lives. When Carthage faced military defeats or economic crises, the sacrifices increased. During the siege by Agathocles in 310 BC, they sacrificed over 500 children in a single ceremony, hoping to turn the tide of war. But wait, there's something even more disturbing about how they selected these children, and it reveals the first clue about that psychological pattern. The wealthy families didn't just sacrifice any children. Archaeological evidence supports these historical accounts. The Tophet contains layer upon layer of infant remains, with inscriptions thanking Moloch for answered prayers. These weren't stillborn children or natural deaths. Bone analysis shows these were healthy infants killed specifically for ritual purposes. The practice was so embedded in Carthaginian culture that wealthy families competed to offer the best sacrifices. Beautiful, healthy children from noble families were considered premium offerings. Some families even bought children from poorer families to sacrifice, turning child murder into a luxury commodity. When the Romans finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, they were genuinely horrified by what they found, and these were people who considered gladiatorial combat entertainment. That's how disturbing Moloch worship was. It shocked even the Romans, but the Carthaginians were just getting started. Because what the Aztecs did makes burning children look almost merciful by comparison. And here's where that psychological pattern becomes impossible to ignore. If you think the Carthaginians were bad, the Aztecs turned human sacrifice into performance art. But here's what's really disturbing. They didn't just kill people for their gods. They created an entire entertainment industry around watching people die in the most elaborate ways possible. The centerpiece of Aztec sacrifice was the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, a massive pyramid where priests would drag victims up steep stone steps to an altar at the top. Using obsidian knives sharper than modern surgical scalpels, they would slice open the victim's chest and rip out the still-beating heart in less than 30 seconds. But here's where you see that psychological pattern again. The Aztecs weren't content with simple efficiency. They turned sacrifice into elaborate theatrical productions that would make modern horror movies look tame, and the crowds? They cheered. Thousands of people would gather to watch other humans get their hearts ripped out, and they treated it like a sporting event. During the festival of Shumolpili, which occurred every 52 years, they would sacrifice thousands of people over several days. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés estimated that 20,000 people were killed during a single festival he witnessed. 20,000 people. That's more than most modern cities. The process was designed for maximum psychological impact. Victims were kept alive and conscious throughout the heart extraction. The priest would hold up the beating heart for the crowd to see before placing it in a special bowl for the sun, god Huitzilopochtli. The body would then be thrown down the pyramid steps, where it would be butchered and distributed as sacred food. But wait, it gets worse. Different gods required different types of sacrifice, each more disturbing than the last. For Tlaloc, the rain god, they preferred children because their tears were thought to bring rain. These children were often tortured before death to ensure they cried enough to satisfy the god. And here's where that pattern becomes crystal clear. For Zipi Totec, the flayed god, priests would skin victims alive and wear their flesh like clothing for 20 days. 20 days of walking around in someone else's skin. But the most disturbing part, the priests who did this were considered the most holy members of society. The Aztecs built their entire calendar around sacrifice. They had specific days for sacrificing warriors, slaves, children, and even volunteers who believed dying for the gods would guarantee them a place in paradise. The Codex Mendoza documents over 80 different types of human sacrifice, each with its own ritual requirements and divine purpose. Archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor reveals the staggering scale of these practices. Excavations have uncovered thousands of human skulls arranged in ritual displays called tzompantli. These weren't just decorations, they were accounting systems that tracked how many people had been sacrificed to maintain cosmic balance. The Spanish were so horrified by Aztec sacrifice that they used it to justify their conquest and forced conversion. Ironically, the Spanish Inquisition was conducting its own religious murders at exactly the same time, but apparently burning heretics alive was more civilized than cutting out hearts. The Aztecs genuinely believed the universe would end if they stopped feeding human blood to their gods. In their worldview, the sun needed daily nourishment of human hearts to continue rising. They weren't being cruel. They were preventing cosmic apocalypse through systematic murder. But here's what connects the Aztecs to the Carthaginians and reveals more of that pattern. Both civilizations convinced themselves that the more horrific the sacrifice, the more powerful the divine protection. It's like they were competing with their own gods to see who could inflict more suffering. And speaking of competition, wait until you hear what the Celtic Druids did. The Celts gave us beautiful art, complex mythology, and some of the most horrifying execution methods in human history. But here's what makes them different from the Carthaginians and Aztecs. Their druids were essentially serial killers with PhD degrees in torture. Julius Caesar, who spent 8 years fighting Celtic tribes in Gaul, documented their most infamous practice: burning people alive inside massive wicker structures shaped like human figures. These weren't small effigies. We're talking about constructions 60 feet tall, large enough to hold hundreds of victims. But here's where that psychological pattern reaches its peak. The Druids didn't just burn people for religious reasons. They claimed they could predict the future by interpreting how victims screamed while burning. Different types of cries supposedly revealed different prophecies about harvests, wars, and political events. They turned human agony into a divination system. Think about that for a second. These were highly educated individuals who had spent decades studying astronomy, law, medicine, and theology. These were the intellectuals of Celtic society, and they used their knowledge to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of ritual murder. The smarter they got, the more creative their torture became. The process was methodical and terrifying. Druids would construct these giant wicker figures during religious festivals, particularly around the summer solstice. They would then fill them with a mixture of criminals, prisoners of war, and volunteers who believed dying in the flames would guarantee them a place in the Celtic afterlife. But here's where you see that pattern again. The Celts weren't just burning random people. They had specific categories for different types of sacrifice. Criminals were burned for purification rituals. Prisoners of war were killed to honor victory gods. Volunteers were sacrificed to ensure good harvests or military success. Each category had its own ritual requirements and divine purpose. Archaeological evidence from bog bodies across northern Europe confirms these practices. The Lindo Man discovered in an English peat bog shows clear signs of ritual murder. He was strangled, had his throat cut, and was struck on the head before being thrown into the bog. Chemical analysis of his stomach contents revealed he had eaten a ritual meal of mistletoe before death. The Druids weren't just conducting random violence. They were running what can only be described as a systematic research program into human suffering. Pliny the Elder described druidic practices that included cutting mistletoe with golden sickles while sacrificing white bulls, drinking human blood mixed with sacred herbs, and conducting elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. The Romans eventually banned Druidism, not because they were squeamish about violence, but because Druidic practices were so extreme, they threatened Roman authority. When the people who invented gladiatorial combat think your religious practices are too violent, you know you've crossed a line. But here's the most disturbing aspect of Celtic sacrifice, and this is where that psychological pattern becomes undeniable. Celtic warriors would volunteer for sacrifice because they genuinely believed dying in ritual flames would make them immortal. They had created a culture where being burned alive was considered a privilege. The Druids had figured out something that the Carthaginians and Aztecs were still learning. If you can convince people that extreme suffering has divine purpose, they'll not only accept it, they'll compete for it. But if you think the Celts were extreme, wait until you hear about the Scythians, because they took this psychological pattern and applied it to an entire social system. The Scythians, nomadic warriors who controlled the steppes of modern Ukraine and Russia, had a simple philosophy about death. If you're important enough to deserve a fancy funeral, everyone who served you should die too. But here's where that psychological pattern reaches its logical extreme. They convinced people that being murdered was actually a promotion. When a Scythian king died, the real horror began. According to Herodotus, who documented these practices in the 5th century BC, the Scythians would strangle the king's wives, concubines, servants, horses, and even his favorite dogs to accompany him into the afterlife. We're talking about 400 or more people killed for a single funeral. But here's what makes the Scythians different from everyone we've discussed so far. Many of these people volunteered for ritual death. Scythian culture taught that serving a king in the afterlife was a higher honor than living as a commoner. Families would compete for the privilege of having their children selected for royal burial. They had created a society where being murdered was considered a promotion. The process was elaborate and systematic. First, they would embalm the king's body using a technique that involved removing internal organs and stuffing the cavity with aromatic herbs. Then they would begin the mass killing. The king's primary wife would be strangled first, followed by his concubines in order of importance. Servants, guards, and slaves would be killed according to their rank in the royal household. But the Scythians weren't content with simple strangulation. They developed elaborate torture methods to ensure the dead king would have properly prepared servants in the afterlife. Some victims had molten gold poured into their wounds. Others were slowly strangled with silk cords while priests chanted prayers. The goal was to create a hierarchy of suffering that would translate into a hierarchy of service in the next world. Archaeological evidence from Scythian burial mounds called kurgans confirms these historical accounts. The Pazyryk burials in Siberia contain hundreds of human skeletons arranged around central royal chambers. Chemical analysis of the bones shows evidence of strangulation, blunt force trauma, and other forms of ritual killing. The most disturbing discovery was the positioning of the bodies. Servants were buried in subservient poses, kneeling, prostrating, or arranged as if still performing their duties. Concubines were positioned as if embracing the dead king. Even the horses were buried in harnesses, ready to pull the royal chariot through eternity. Here's where that psychological pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Scythians justified this mass murder through their belief in an afterlife that exactly mirrored earthly social structures. They couldn't imagine a king existing without his full retinue of servants, so they simply killed everyone who might be useful in the next world. Death was just a change of address that required moving the entire household. The practice was so embedded in Scythian culture that it continued for centuries, even as they came into contact with Greek and Persian civilizations that found it horrifying. The Scythians simply couldn't understand why other cultures thought mass human sacrifice was problematic. To them, it was just good management. But if you think the Scythians were the peak of this psychological pattern, you're wrong. Because what happened in India shows how this same mindset can persist for over 1,000 years and convince an entire gender that suicide is their highest calling. India gave the world mathematics, philosophy, and one of the most systematically oppressive religious practices in human history, sati, the burning of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. For over 1,000 years, Indian society convinced women that the best way to honor their dead husbands was to throw themselves into the flames and burn alive. But here's where that psychological pattern I've been hinting at finally becomes crystal clear. Sati wasn't just a religious practice. It was a social institution that solved multiple problems for patriarchal society while convincing the victims it was their idea. Widows were considered unlucky and economically burdensome. They couldn't remarry, couldn't inherit property, and were often blamed for their husbands' deaths. Burning them alive eliminated these inconveniences while providing a convenient religious justification. It's the same pattern we've seen with every civilization. Convince people that extreme suffering serves a higher purpose, and they'll not only accept it, they'll volunteer for it. The process was elaborate and designed to prevent escape. Widows would be given opium or other drugs to make them compliant. They would be dressed in wedding clothes and jewelry, then led to a specially constructed pyre where their husband's body was already burning. Family members would surround the pyre to prevent any attempts to flee once the flames became unbearable. But sati wasn't limited to adult women. Child marriages were common in medieval India, which meant child widows were also expected to burn themselves alive. Girls as young as 8 or 9 would be thrown onto funeral pyres because their elderly husbands had died. The practice was so normalized that families would celebrate these deaths as religious achievements. The British colonial administration documented thousands of sati cases in the early 19th century. In Bengal alone, over 8,000 women were burned alive between 1815 and 1828. These weren't isolated incidents. They were public spectacles that drew crowds of spectators who considered watching women burn alive to be religious entertainment. Regional variations made the practice even more horrifying. In Rajasthan, the practice of jauhar involved mass widow burning during military defeats. When Rajput fortresses were about to fall to enemy forces, hundreds of women would throw themselves onto collective pyres rather than face capture. The 1303 siege of Chittorgarh resulted in over 13,000 women burning themselves alive in a single day. The religious justification for sati was that a woman's spiritual duty was to serve her husband in life and death. Hindu texts claim that women who died on their husbands' pyres would be reunited with them in heaven and would purify their families of sins. The practice was presented as voluntary religious devotion rather than murder, but the reality was systematic coercion backed by religious authority. Women who refused sati were ostracized, denied food and shelter, and treated as social outcasts. Their own families would pressure them to die rather than bring shame on the household. The choice was between burning alive or living as a social pariah. The British finally banned sati in 1829, but the practice continued illegally for decades. Even today, isolated cases still occur in rural India, proving that this psychological pattern can persist for centuries once it becomes embedded in cultural consciousness. Now here's the psychological pattern that connects all these civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. They all discovered the same terrifying truth about human nature. If you can convince people that extreme suffering serves a divine purpose, they will not only accept it, they will compete to inflict it on themselves and others. This is what psychologists now call sacred violence, the phenomenon where religious belief transforms acts of extreme cruelty into acts of ultimate devotion. Every civilization we've discussed followed the same psychological progression. First, they established that their gods demanded sacrifice. Second, they convinced people that the more extreme the sacrifice, the greater the divine reward. Third, they created social systems where participating in this violence became a mark of status and refusing it became social suicide. The Carthaginians competed to offer the most beautiful children. The Aztecs turned heart extraction into public entertainment. The Celts convinced warriors that burning alive was a privilege. The Scythians made murder look like a promotion. The Hindus convinced women that suicide was their highest calling. But here's the most disturbing part. This same psychological pattern is still operating today. We see it in suicide bombers who believe martyrdom guarantees paradise. We see it in religious extremists who think violence serves God's will. We see it in cults that convince followers to die for their beliefs. The technology changes, but the psychology remains the same. Humans have an apparently limitless capacity to transform cruelty into devotion, as long as they believe it serves a higher purpose. These ancient civilizations weren't more primitive than us. They were just more honest about the violence that lurks beneath religious devotion. They built temples to house their brutality instead of hiding it in back rooms and secret facilities. The real question isn't why ancient people did these things. The real question is, what sacred violence are we committing today that future civilizations will look back on with the same horror we feel about child sacrifice and widow burning? Because if history teaches us anything, it's that every civilization thinks it's more civilized than the ones that came before, and every civilization is wrong.